can see that the participants are rolling in. I'm going to let a few more people join before we start. We're just on 2 o'clock. I'm going to give it till 1 minute past, just to check that everybody's joined on time. And just to give a bit of how it will work today. Today is 75 minutes. We've got a few polls that we'll be using during the webinar, and also there is the option to write questions during the webinar. Today we want to be as interactive as possible, so the panel is going to be answering questions. We're going to be looking at the polls. It's going to be very, very fluid. It's going to have a really good flow. So if you do have a burning question, please write that in the chat and we'll make sure that we're able to pick that up and take it. We already have some questions in advance. And what I would say as well is that please ask any question. I don't know if the people on today had joined last time, but this is a very honest, very open discussion. So you should be able to think that you can talk about anything that you want to, and nothing is off limits. So it's 1 minute past. So I think we'll kick off. And I wanted to, since we're talking about mental health today, I wanted to give a little admission from myself that about an hour ago, I started freaking out. I started having a bit of imposter syndrome, thinking, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? I'm not a mental health expert. I'm bringing these fantastic people together. We've got people from over 200 countries joining us today, all over the world. They're listening to us speak. I'm not good enough. I shouldn't be doing this. It should be someone else. And I texted my very, very good friend, Murray McLaren, and told him this. And he emailed straight back and said, Melissa, you're not supposed to be a mental health nurse, but actually what you're supposed to do is connect. And this is what you're doing. And you're connecting people today on the panel, and you're communicating and connecting. So that made me feel a lot better. And from that, what I would say to everybody, and that none of us are invincible, is that actually that vulnerability piece, which is something we're going to talk about quite a lot today, it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to say, oh, I'm freaking out. So I wanted to share that with everybody today. So just in case there's anybody in the audience who's thinking, oh, this is only me, it's really not. So I hope that helps. So what I'd like to do is, we've got a fantastic panel here today. You'll recognize Jeff Davis. Jeff was on our first panel, which was about 6 weeks ago. And in that, we talked a lot about resilience. We talked a lot about vulnerability. And Jeff is a real advocate for vulnerability, for mental well-being. And I'm just so delighted that when I asked him, I think it was about a year ago we first started talking about this, that he would actually join this series and we could do some work together. I was so utterly delighted. So thank you so much, Jeff. And then we also have Elizabeth Rimmer, and Elizabeth is someone that I've known of for many, many years. And again, somebody who I saw on social media, I went to events, I saw speaking, the thought that one day I could email Elizabeth and say, will you join one of our webinars? And she would say yes. And even more than that, that actually Elizabeth and I would end up on a mental wellbeing committee for the IBA together, was something that years ago I didn't even consider. And then another great person is Andy Ramage. Many of you will have heard of Andy. Andy was one of the founders around 1 Year No Beer, and Andy has been on even bigger podcasts and webinars than today, talking about that and talking about why he set that up, and he's going to talk about that in a second. And now actually looking at actually how you can avoid that and avoid addiction and look after yourself better. So perhaps Jeff, if you'd like to kick off and talk about why you're here today.
Sure. Can you hear me okay, Melissa?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So hi, everybody. My name is Jeff Davis, and I'm the Chief Legal and Corporate Affairs Officer of Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. And I started my career as a corporate lawyer in private practice. And since then, at Ontario Teachers, I've worked with firms all over the world. And if I'm being honest, if I look back on my professional and academic career, by around the mid-90s, I developed an insatiable desire to score 100, to be the best, to achieve perfection. And when something was less than perfect, I didn't simply kind of judge myself. I could actually feel my mistakes no matter how small they were. They made me angry, or they hurt. And they were signs that I wasn't good enough, or worse, that I was a fake, that I didn't deserve my success. Well, for me, life went on, and I had a few failures like all of us do. But in 2012, I encountered my biggest failure in my life. I was going to get divorced for a second time, which led me into this all-consuming sense of shame about what my life had become. And one night, when I was trying to figure out how to cope with this, I discovered a TED Talk by Brene Brown. I was Googling, what is shame? Brene Brown, I'm sure many of you have heard of her. She's the world-renowned shame researcher. And she unpacked the concept of shame and how it worked, explaining how everyone carries it. And there is one variable that separates those people who can live with shame and those who cannot. The first group, who can live with it, felt worthy of love and belonging despite their flaws, and the second group didn't. And understanding that simple idea helped me rediscover self-worth, courage, confidence, and actually changed a lot in my life, including not personally, but I started to bring these ideas into my professional practice. I was learning how to accept failure without questioning self-worth. And since that point, really, I've read everything I can get my hands on when it comes to behavior, psychology, relationships, and leadership. And I think it's really relevant to the discussion we want to have here today. So hopefully that gives a good intro.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jeff. And Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Rimmer. I'm the Chief Executive at LawCare. Thanks for inviting me along today, Melissa. And I think just picking up what you're saying about your imposter syndrome around talking about mental health, I think it's really important that we all recognize we all have mental health, just like we have physical health. And it's something we should all feel able to talk about and share our experiences. We may not be experts or psychologists, but we can talk about mental health and how that impacts us. And that's really what a big purpose of a webinar like this is today, is to really get those conversations going. So LawCare is a charity that supports and promotes mental health and wellbeing throughout the UK's legal community. I was a solicitor in private practice, and I left law back in the 90s. And I think when I reflect on that, I think at the time, perhaps it wasn't meeting my idealistic expectations of what I thought working in the law would all be like, even though I had what I considered to be my dream job. And I had some difficulties with that. So I thought I'd take it some time out and do a bit more studying. And I never went back to the law, but I landed up in the voluntary sector. So I've been working in small mental health charities for about almost 20 years now, and came to LawCare about 6 years ago. So LawCare is here to support people working in the legal sector. We run support services for that, primarily a telephone helpline where people can call and speak to another lawyer about things that are concerning them. And something we hear about often through our support channels is perfectionism. This is a very common trait in lawyers, which we're going to be exploring today. And that when perfectionism perhaps overspills into other aspects of life, or we don't manage it well, that can have an impact on our mental health and well-being. Through the last year, I think what we've seen is that mental health has just gone so much higher up the agenda for all of us as individuals, because we've all experienced days and times during the last year that have been tough, some more than others, depending on our circumstances. But I think perhaps it's been, if we want to look at the say benefits of, or the learnings from COVID, I think it's really shone a light on mental health and given us a much better platform to talk about things, not only as individuals, but also in workplaces. So in the legal sector, I think we've seen mental health just bump much higher up the agenda, particularly over the last 6 months. And what we've been seeing coming through in our support channels, the issues people are raising with us are the ones you would expect, really. Our concerns around their mental health deteriorating, the struggles about working from home, even though that can have great benefits. Many people miss the social interaction and the banter in the office, that sense of belonging, that sense of team, supervision, the social isolation that people feel, particularly if you live on your own, and particularly for younger people, I think, in the profession, and also overload. I think what we've seen in the legal sector, certainly in the UK, is productivity has gone up. And I think we need to ask ourselves at what cost. I think what's happened, perhaps driven by some of those perfectionist tendencies, we're just working longer hours and filling that dead commute time with more work. So there's lots to talk about, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to be talking about such a big issue in the law, and something perhaps we don't talk about enough. So thank you.
Very good point, Elizabeth. I think you're right. Thank you. Thank you. And Andy.
My name's Andy Ramage. I'm not involved in the law industry, but my background was originally as a professional athlete, which breeds perfectionism. And then I stepped into the world of, I guess, high finance as a broker. And then I run 2 brokerages myself, and found myself in an environment which was fueled by perfectionism in many ways. And the fallout from that, I think that we had many maladaptive ways of coping, substance abuse, alcohol, or just generally, I think, maladaptive processes to try and deal with the stresses and the strains, but also that coupled with an environment that is in many ways creates a situation where people are scared to be vulnerable. People are scared to own up to the fact that they're actually finding things quite difficult, and that created a really, I think, in many ways, quite dangerous environment for lots of people. So my own journey into that was that I had a relationship with alcohol. It wasn't problematic to the point of addiction, but it was still getting in the way of the way I was functioning in my life, in my home life. It was becoming an annoyance, to say the least. So I decided to take a break from alcohol, and it was one of the most powerful things I've ever done. To this day, it was transformational in my career, in my home life, in my physical health and well-being. And it was such an inspirational experience that I created a movement around that called oneyearnobeer.com, which essentially are challenges, 28, 19, 365 day challenges. And the reason that's important is because what it did, it started to break down the stigma of this being vulnerable. It allowed people to come out of the woodwork in various industries and say, hey, I'm just going to take a challenge. This is just a cool, fun, exciting challenge. There's no stigma attached to this. But equally, it was allowing people to then face up to the fact that maybe they did need to review their relationship with alcohol or substances. So I'm all about trying to create initiatives that make it incredibly easy for people to change their behaviors and feel free from stigma. And I think that's a big barrier that we're trying to readdress at the moment. So that's why I'm here today.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much, Andy. And it'd be great to hear more about that and more about the positives, because I know that quite a few of us are not leading into addiction, but in the last 12 months, I think a lot of people have gone one way or the other. A lot of people have said, oh gosh, because I'm just at home all the time, I have to do something to make it the end of the day, so I have a glass of wine. And other people have said, actually, during lockdown and the last 12 months, I've actually stopped drinking because I decided to become more healthy. So I think people have dealt with it in different ways. And I guess it's, trying to put a movement together like 1 Year No Beer was clearly something huge. But was it in most countries throughout the world that it was picked up?
Yeah, we started this 7 years ago thinking it was only going to be broker types that looked at it. And within, I think, 6 weeks, it was in many, many countries all over the world. Our ebook at the time being downloaded 10,000 times. And what people were resonating with was the messaging that there was nothing to give up and everything to gain. This was really important. And because we packaged it as a challenge, I think people felt comfortable about coming out of the woodwork to say, actually, I can do that. And again, we started to reduce some of the stigma around having these conversations, which has been huge for mental health in general across many industries, and something I'm incredibly proud of.
Yeah, very, very proud of you that you did it, and very happy to have you here today. And something that you mentioned, and I'm going to ask you and Jeff to talk about this. You mentioned the word maladaptive quite a few times, and I know that I've read in a few of Jeff's articles that he's written around adaptive, maladaptive types of perfectionism. And we've already had some questions in advance, and when I was talking to people as well about this topic, a few people were saying, yes, but surely perfectionism isn't always bad, is it? And so could I ask perhaps both of you, could I go to you, Jeff, first of all, to talk about that and what you found with it?
Sure. So I think the perfectionism problem that we usually talk about is maladaptive. It's a maladaptive coping mechanism as opposed to adaptive. What I would describe, adaptive perfectionism is a healthy striving for excellence that comes from a place of innate worth. You can challenge yourself. I think I can do a better job than I did last time. Like it's something that it feels from a place of worthiness, as opposed to Maladaptive comes from a place of fear of making mistakes. It can, you know, it is to break it into 3 different categories, actually, of perfectionism, maladaptive perfectionism. One is the kind they call self-oriented, where you tell yourself you're not smart enough, not wealthy enough, not clever enough. Like you have that voice in your head telling you that. The second is other-oriented perfectionism, and that's where you're holding other people out to unreasonable standards of perfection. And the third category is called socially oriented perfectionism. And that's where the society or the culture creates standards, unattainable standards of perfection. And those are all in the maladaptive category. And really, at the end of the day, they come from a place of fear of making mistakes, when at the root of being human, we do make mistakes. We are imperfect. So it's kind of this futile challenge that people put themselves through, and it leads to a number of unhealthy behaviors. It's correlated to anxiety disorder, eating disorders, suicide ideation, burnout. Like it's really dangerous stuff. So when we talk about being a perfectionist, or you're in a job interview and say, oh, my greatest weakness is I'm a perfectionist, that's like, they're really loaded terms, and it's actually a really dangerous thing. Does that help?
Yeah, that's very helpful.
I don't know, Andy, if that's, I don't know what your take on it is.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. It's exactly as I understand it. I love the work of Carol Dweck, and I know we mentioned her before. It's a brilliant book on mindset, and she talks about these 2 concepts of a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. But what's really interesting, I bet lots of people listening to this, myself included, had a lot of success with a fixed mindset, which is that perfectionist mindset. You know, when I was an athlete, that thing drove me beyond belief. Not because I wanted to win, I didn't want to lose. I couldn't bear to lose, because a fixed mindset puts you in that space where you believe you're sort of genetically fixed at birth. There's no wiggle room to learn or grow. You're either smart or dumb. You're a success or a failure. That's sort of, I think, in many ways, the breeding ground for perfectionism. And I had success with that. And I'm sure many people in the law space have had lots of success with that mindset. So it creates this weird juxtaposition. If it's like, I don't want to give that up, because maybe then my career will suffer, or maybe I won't achieve as much. But what I discovered quite quickly is that you plateau with that fixed mindset. It's not until you give yourself the space, and you described it brilliantly there, Jeff, around that growth mindset, willing to do your best, but also push yourself on, but accept the fact that you're perfectly imperfect. If you can get into that space, and it's really hard for lots of us, because obviously when we've achieved success in one area, we want to stick with that same methodology. But when you come out the other side of that, that's where the real big gains. And I think lots of the people that are really leveling up in their life across the board approach life with a growth mindset. So I'd highly recommend that to anyone who hasn't read that book or seen the TED Talk. Carol Dweck is a brilliant overview of this type of thinking.
Thank you. And I think with that, Emma, our lovely Emma in our team, would you mind launching our first poll, please? So we've got a good few people who've joined now. Let's launch the poll. So the question here: do you feel that the pressure to appear perfect in a high performance legal environment makes it difficult to have a bad day and be kind to yourself from a mental health perspective? So we'll give it another 30 seconds. We've got a few more people to vote. It's good that people are thinking about this as well. People aren't just answering straight away. Okay, I think we'll end the poll now. I think we've got a good number there. Okay, so can everyone in the panel see the results there? So we've got yes 87%, and we've got no 13%. Perhaps Elizabeth, I could go to you first. Are you surprised with those results?
No, I'm not surprised by those results. I think, picking up on what Andy and Jeff have been saying, that analogy of fitting your oxygen mask first and self-care and looking after yourself in order to be able to do your best legal work is really important. And I think lawyers have it in their minds that they just have to prioritize getting on with the work, and looking after themselves comes behind all of that, if at all. They don't see it as something that actually helps to contribute to them doing good work. So no, I'm not surprised by that, because I think we hear day in, day out stories from lawyers who see there's those sorts of issues as a sign of weakness. They're not cut out for the law. The fear of making mistakes. So yeah, I'm not remotely surprised, because I think we all know that within the legal sector. This is not a surprise to any of us. Yeah.
And I think at this point we've got a question from the audience that was sent in advance, which I think sits well here, which is, how is it possible not to seek perfectionism and or to feel the consequences when mistakes are made, when the stakes are so high, as are the expectations and the level of responsibility for many lawyers, particularly those representing in areas of law where people's lives are in the balance and we play such a significant part in this process? Jeff, perhaps if I could come to you on that question.
Sure, and it's an interesting question, because it focuses on what the feeling is, like how it is that you can't feel this fear of being imperfect because of the responsibility. But the problem with not the problem with the question, the truth is we do make mistakes. Like, it's unavoidable. So if you want to be terrified of what is going to happen all the time, then you can spend your life and work doing that. Or you can accept that you actually make mistakes, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not successful, that you're not worthy, that you're actually probably quite worthy of all the success and accolades you receive as a lawyer, despite the fact you're also flawed. And like, that's the way that I would think about it. And I'm not sure that I'm not sure that if you kind of you spend your time trying so hard to be perfect. I even think that the law itself allows for mistakes. Like, most mistakes that happen, whether in litigation or in a corporate transaction or whatever, there are ways to rectify that. But if you have an attitude that is trying to bury mistakes, erase all mistakes, have no evidence of any kind of mistakes, I think that's what you're going to create. And those things are going to be hidden, and they're going to fester and create much bigger problems down the road. That would be my take.
Yeah, and I think it is. And I think that point about mistakes, I mean, we've seen there's been lots of coverage, hasn't it, particularly around young lawyers recently, where they've made mistakes, and actually being in a culture of perhaps of fear of needing to be perfect, that actually they haven't fessed up around those mistakes. And it's not the mistake itself, but it's actually hiding it that has caused a problem. Some have been struck off. Some of them, their careers are decimated. You know, we all know that mistake that we all made in our careers. I remember myself being around 25, I think it was, and somebody had emailed to attend an event, and I knew this person. I knew this person was perhaps not somebody who we'd want at this event. So I forwarded it to my boss and said, "Oh no, this person is trying to attend our event. You know, I'll go back and tell them whatever." Fortunately, I didn't forward it. I replied. And what this person did was they replied to me, and they copied in every journalist contact that I knew. So actually the shame around the mistake that I'd made, and I remember sitting there at my desk thinking that was my career was over. That was it. I would never be able to work in PR again. I'd been utterly shamed for this mistake, and going down to my boss and saying, "I have made a horrendous mistake." And he said, "What is it?" And I told him, and he said, "Oh, is that it? Oh, that's fine." And I remember going back to my desk, but again, it was a lesson that taught me at a very young age that actually, what is the worst thing that could happen? And actually, at the time, it felt like the worst thing that could happen was I would tell and the shame around it as well. So I think, and again, that vulnerability piece, I think, comes in there. And all of us have already talked about vulnerability. We're only half an hour in, and we've mentioned the word vulnerability so many different times. And you know, Elizabeth, when you're taking lots of calls, when you've been having your helpline coming through, are you finding that people are finding it difficult to be vulnerable in the workplace, to talk about any problems that they might have? And what are they hoping for, I guess?
Yes, I think, those junior lawyer cases are a great example of, I think, the culture in law that doesn't support talking about mistakes and when things go wrong. And lawyers find it very hard to admit that they've made a mistake. because they're concerned that'll be a career limiting step. They'll be seen as weak, particularly if you're a junior in the profession. You might think this is game over for me, and you know how competitive it is to get in. If you leave, there'll be 1,000 people waiting to take your place. And I think what people are hoping for is an environment that feels psychologically safe. And somebody was saying to me the other day, we were having a chat, and I'd never thought of this analogy, but I think it's a great one. Said cars have bumpers, pencils have rubbers and erasers at the end. Human beings make mistakes. This is part of life. And feeding into picking up on that growth mindset, we all know that we learn way much more from the things that go badly wrong than the things that go well. But our challenge in law is that we don't have a culture where we talk about mistakes. And I think that we'd be better served if part of legal education, or in your early part of your career, we actually had some training around that, where if you joined a firm, maybe there was a seminar where senior people in the firm talked about mistakes that they had made, exactly like what you've just described, because everybody has probably sent the email to the wrong person and then felt absolutely sick at the consequences. So I think really what we hear all the time is that fear of telling somebody what's happened. And we have got to challenge that in law, because that's not only damaging to that individual, that is a risk to the reputation of the legal profession. It's a risk to your business. It's a risk to the regulatory framework that lawyers operate in. Lawyers are held to very high standards of honesty and integrity and conduct. And if you are operating in that kind of environment, then you are more likely to make mistakes as well and cover them up. So I think people are looking for open cultures where we talk about these things. You look at the airline industry, why flying is so safe is because there's an open investigation every time something goes wrong. And I'm not saying we need forensic examination of every mistake in a law firm, but I think there needs to be more learning around what does go wrong to help people feel able to talk about it. And as Jeff said, most mistakes can be rectified, and they're much better likely to be rectified at the beginning, early on. And if they can't be fixed, well, that's why there's insurance. It can be dealt with. So I think that's where we need to move to, just talking about these things more and bringing them out of the shadows.
And I guess, and we've all mentioned it as well around the around shame. And it was Brené Brown who said, when perfectionism is driving, shame is always driving shotgun. So it's if you're focused, if you're driving towards perfectionism, then actually if you're not going to reach that, then shame is permanently going to be sat on your shoulder. And actually then shame and vulnerability, they then cannot sit alongside each other. And Jeff, I know that you've written about this
Sure.
a lot, and that striving perfectionism, eroding that ability to be vulnerable and to connect. What impact does that have on resilience, perhaps?
Sure. So there's a lot of concepts there, and I think you're hitting on like one of the critical elements there, which is shame. I think when the idea of making mistakes, I think we all know we make mistakes. We do it all the time. We make them every day. And I don't think that's the thing that we're really afraid of. I think what we're afraid of is being judged for being foolish by other people. So that kind of perfectionist mindset is actually a lot to do with getting approval of others and feeling ashamed that, if they knew the mistakes you make, that they would reject you, they would think you're dumb or whatever, that kind of thing. And that's what stops when Elizabeth is saying like the mistakes aren't openly discussed. That's really what it's about. It's like, I'm embarrassed about it, I'm ashamed about it. But the thing is, if you can accept that you make mistakes, but you're also proud of what you do and how well you do it, that is the recipe for top performance. And I actually think that these conversations that we're having here about mental health and open up to have these conversations, they're not just about feel goods. Like, it's not a nice thing to do. It's actually a business imperative. Like, this is the recipe for top performance. These are the things that, if you don't do this, it'll stand in the way of businesses in law firms becoming more successful in the future, I believe. When you talk about resilience as an example, so I think of a resilience is being able to kind of stand up against failure and setback and be able to kind of rise and just not give up. So what that takes it takes the ability to be vulnerable. It's like, you know what, I failed at something, but I'm going to try it again. And I think that's why these concepts like shame and perfectionism and resilience and courage, they're all tied to this one thing that we keep mentioning, which is vulnerability. And I think there's a reason for that. And I think that vulnerability, the ability to actually accept that we're vulnerable, makes us feel connected to one another. If I reveal myself, I'm not perfect, I make these mistakes to you, you know me a little better. But if I'm going to put up this armor and I'm going to perfect my image of myself for you, if I'm going to present that way, I'm going to feel disconnected from you at the end of the day. And you're going to pick up on that too. That person's all too perfect. Who's that person really? I think there's a human need and desire to connect. And that is where this piece on vulnerability comes into play. And wow, if we could somehow move to an environment that Andy's referred to and Elizabeth's referred to as a growth mindset in a law firm, where we accept mistakes, it doesn't mean we're not striving for excellence. Then we might create an environment where people feel a lot more connected to one another, willing to take chances more, to innovate more, trust each other more. And those are the ingredients for top performance in my view.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jeff. And obviously, as a buyer of legal services as well, you've talked very openly about the fact that when you're doing that, you want to talk openly, you want to connect, you want to work with firms who have that mindset and who talk about really encouraging that mindset, not, I guess, greenwashing and just talking about it, saying, oh, we do it, but they're not actually putting it into practice, I think is very important. And Andy, perhaps I can come to you on this, because, you know, you talked about 1 year no beer, and you talked about the fact that for you, giving up alcohol then and doing the challenge, but of course something like alcohol is often used as a way for people to connect with each other and to perhaps feel a bit more relaxed. So if you take that away, what did you find with that experiment and with running that? Did you find that people were easier to connect or finding it more difficult?
Actually, I think it transforms things in many ways, because we use alcohol in our industry to do business. Essentially, it was a huge part of what we did, but equally people would use it as a way to de-stress and relax and chill out and all of those type of things. So it had that sort of self-medicating benefit to many people, as well as being a social tool, which we mentioned that word again. It becomes this maladaptive way of coping with certain situations that can lead to inherent problems. But before I get into that, I just wanted to say as well, my background, whilst I was in the brokerage, I went back to university part-time to do a degree and a master's degree in positive psychology. And the big learning from positive psychology, just to tie it back to what Jeff was saying, is that when we improve our well-being first, i.e. become happier, for want of a really general term, we're much more likely to be successful. And that's a really important learning, I think, from a performance basis for law firms and brokerages and athletes who I do a lot of work with, that if we can work on our well-being first, we're more likely to be successful, rather than, I think, the conventional thinking, which is when I reach a certain pay grade, then ta-da, I'll be magically happy forever, right? How's that going for everyone? It's not working.
Yeah.
So I think the way that Jeff and Elizabeth talking about this is so important, that just having these conversations, by the way, I think are fantastic. I just want to salute you all for having these conversations, because whether we're talking about shame, whether we're talking about alcohol, whether we're talking about mindfulness and mental health in general, I think that's part of the process. It allows people to realize, oh, someone like me is also vulnerable. Someone like me has also struggled and made mistakes and experienced shame, and they're not perfect. And from my experience of running this into brokerages, people will come out of the woodwork all the time you at least suspect. I run one mindfulness session with my group of brokers. I thought they would dismiss it and poo-poo it. And I mentioned to this when we got together prior. 2 of them came out of the woodwork and said, I'm really struggling. And it just opened up this conversation. It wasn't what the conversation was about, but the fact that we had the courage to share and open up. And I think that's what we're doing here, whether it's about shame or perfectionism, is really incredibly important. So sorry, just to come back quickly to the alcohol. I think it was just a crutch that many people used. And again, my story and being open and honest as the leader of that business and that firm, and said, I'm not going to drink anymore. And the reason I wasn't drinking was because of performance. That changed the game. That changed the mindset. It was like, oh, the guy that runs the show for us doesn't drink. Why? Because he wants to be better at his job. And that, I think, sent the right message in all the way down that gave people the courage to say, do you know what, I'm not going to do that thing either because it's affecting my marriage, it's affecting my health. So I think, and Elizabeth has touched on this, I think it's really important to get in at the senior level as well and send the right messaging, whether that's about vulnerability, whether that's about imperfection, whether that's about changing your relationship with alcohol, so it filters down and people feel comfortable about it.
And I think Emma, I think we'll launch another poll. I think we'll launch our second poll, please, about mental health strain. So this one, can everybody see this? If your mental health was struggling, do you feel you could talk to your line manager comfortably about the challenges you are facing and ask for help? Okay, so I think we'll give this a couple more seconds. Okay, I think we'll end the poll now. Okay, so that's interesting. And I think I'm pretty quite happy to see this, in that the majority are looking like they'd either say yes they can, or that actually possibly, but they may worry about it having effect on their future career, whereas actually people saying probably not and definitely not are quite low. So and Emma, can we launch the next poll as well? And we're going to come back to talking about both of those polls.
I'd love to know the answer to that poll if you asked it before COVID.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I'd like to talk about that as well. So here we go. Here's the second poll. When your mental health is strained, are you more likely to reach for a drink, do some exercise, ask for help, and throw yourself into work? This is going to be an interesting one. Okay, I'm going to give this until 30 seconds. Okay, let's end the poll there. Okay, so we've got a quarter of people saying they would reach for a drink. We've got 35% doing exercise, just 12% asking for help, and quite a large number, 28% throwing themselves into work. So we've had two polls there. So the first poll was talking about line managers and whether you're able to ask for help. And Jeff made an extremely good point there. I wonder what that would have been like 12 months ago. And I think we had quite a good number there saying that they could talk to them, but the biggest number was, I think I could, but they still had in the back of their mind, but will that affect my career going forward? But what was good was that the number saying no, absolutely, definitely not, was low. Then when we looked at the poll there around what do people do, what do they reach for, it's quite a spread. We had quite a few people saying that they'd reach for a drink. We had then similar number saying that they would reach for exercise, and then a similar number saying that they would throw themselves into work, but quite a low number saying that they would actually ask for help. So perhaps, Elizabeth, perhaps I could come to you first on those two polls. What are your thoughts?
Well, I was really encouraged by the first poll. I thought it was good to see that about half the people felt they could talk to somebody. And I think Jeff's point's interesting. What would that have been like prior to COVID? Because I think COVID, sort of picking up on the vulnerability theme, it has given us an opportunity to share a little bit more, because most Zoom calls and meetings I've had, most people, even if I've never met them before, we've had a couple of minutes talking about COVID, how we're finding it, what the impact's been. And I think when people open up, you often hear lots of stories about what people have been experiencing. So I think, there's an element that perhaps COVID has made lawyers a bit more human, because we've had more of those conversations. And we've also had a peek into the way other people's lives in a way that we never did before. We always saw people suited and booted in the office, so to speak. Now you might see your boss sitting there in a hoodie, and his kids come in, or the dog's barking. You can see the art on the walls or the books and think, oh, I never thought he'd be reading, wall-to-wall John Grisham's or whatever it is. So I think it's given us, it's lifted the veil a little bit, and we're actually seeing each other in a way that we never have before, because we're seeing our colleagues in their home environment, who they are when they're at home, because I think we're different people sometimes when we're in the workplace. So I was encouraged by that. I think with the second poll, though, I was just doing quick maths there. Slightly less, I think it was about 47%, are using a healthy coping mechanism, i.e. asking for help or doing some exercise. And the balance goes slightly the other way for the unhealthy coping mechanisms, be it alcohol or just throwing yourself into work. And actually, LawCare had its roots in alcohol. We were set up in 1997 because the Law Society in England and Wales was concerned about how much solicitors were drinking and using alcohol as an unhealthy coping mechanism for life in the law. I guess for all the reasons Andy was saying, it's socially acceptable, it's free, it's legal, it's a big part of our culture to celebrate and commiserate with going to the pub or having a drink and schmoozing clients, all of that. I think there has been, though, a shift in attitudes around that, because we actually haven't seen any significant increase in calls about alcohol. In fact, we don't get many at all. What we have seen is a big increase in calls about anxiety. And I think also with perhaps a lawyer characteristic, or maybe for all of us, is that when we're busy and feeling the strain, I'm not surprised by the throwing yourself into work answer, because we actually chuck out of our lives all those simple things that help maintain our mental health and well-being. We stop exercising, we just stay at work longer, or we work longer in the home office or on the kitchen table. We sacrifice the things that actually help us stay in a good place mentally. And if people, I think, understood better that actually the solution does not lie in doing more work, the solution lies in finding healthy coping strategies like exercise or talking to someone. And disappointed even in the second one that actually asking for help was the lowest, yet people felt slightly more comfortable to speak about things. And I think that, I guess that maybe feeds into our discussion around vulnerability, because asking for help means you've got to admit that something's up, and that's not easy. And I think often there's that fear other people will judge you, again, for all the reasons we've been talking about. But what we hear on our helpline is actually when people call us, that taking that step to ask for help is an enormous sense of relief and reassurance that you're not the only person that feels that way or has experienced that, and actually find it's a positive step to help you move forward. And I think that shows us perhaps we've got to do some more work around helping people in the law see that asking for help is actually a really positive step to take if you are struggling.
And I think, Anderson, we've got quite a few questions coming through, and I know that today we've talked about the law and we've mainly predominantly focused on lawyers, but of course the law isn't just about lawyers. And we've got a very good question here, which says it could be worth mentioning how lawyers' addiction to perfectionism impacts on those supporting them too, perhaps business services teams, PAs, etc., and their mental health. What does the panel think about that? Perhaps, Jeff, I could ask you first of all.
So that it's a great question, and that falls in that second category, the other-oriented perfectionism. That's where you demand perfection of other people, of unreasonable standards of perfection. Here's the problem with that. Is that so if you're a perfectionist and you do that to yourself and you mess your head up that way, and then you lead that way, you're forcing other people into that mindset. Because at the end of the day, if your boss is a perfectionist, guess what? You're gonna either quit or you're gonna have to get into that mindset yourself. And it's such a toxic mindset. So I think what's needed is that leaders need to really kind of step up and be the ones to take those vulnerable steps first. If they don't, no one else is going to. And I think that one thing that maybe help us get over that perfectionist mindset is realize that we're not just damaging ourselves, we're damaging people we lead. Like it's pretty serious stuff.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Jeff. And we've got some more questions coming through. I'm quite keen to answer them. We've got one here. So much of feelings of success are tied into earning, particularly in the legal profession. What are the panel's views on how we judge ourselves professionally and finding the balance between gaining value from our work without feeling success is viewed by the measure of title and earnings? Perhaps, Andy, if I could come to you first on that, obviously with the way that your career has changed, what would you have to say about that?
That really resonates with me, and my epiphany, as it were, it's one of those slow ones over a period of months, but it was very much reaching that traditional yardstick of success within a broken environment. And I got there and thought, well, I should be endlessly happy. Here comes Nirvana. It didn't arrive. And I sort of felt, actually, I'm about 5 out of 10 in terms of my well-being. I was 3 stone heavier, unfit, unmotivated, yet earnings were through the roof. You know, I was in that place. And I had a little look around at those people more successful than me up the earnings ladder. And all I saw was broken bodies, broken minds, broken homes. And I was like, what are we doing? I don't aspire to that. I don't want that. You know, what's important to me is my health, my family. So I started to just shift the whole thing. I was like, right, I'm not going to base my success on earnings. I'm actually going to go back and actually base my success on health and fitness and my relationship with my family. And the beautiful irony of that, as I mentioned earlier, and positive psychology, all the science supports that, my earnings went through the roof. But, you know, so I think you end up there in a different way, but you do it from the right place. That's what I'm all about now. I work with a lot of athletes and elite performance, and we just start in that base of what's important, your health, your vibrancy, your connection. And then the irony is, because you're performing better, earnings tend to rise.
And Elizabeth, I wonder, you know, with all the calls that you get into the helpline, you know, is it mixed, or is it are you finding it's actually a lot of it's quite senior partners and leaders in law firms who would be, I guess, in that type of earnings bracket, or are you finding it's quite mixed? And does that topic come up at all?
Well, on the helpline, almost half our calls would come from the junior end of the profession. But then we have specifically targeted them because we know they're vulnerable. But we do get senior people calling us. And obviously, we've just seen in the legal media this yesterday about the partner at Freeth's who was burnt out and had a significant billing target and was working 15 hours a day, and the impact that that had on him. I think a challenge, though, around measuring success is what metrics do we have in private practice in law? It's the chargeable hour. And on the whole, that's how people are judged for bonus and promotion and how success is defined. And even though you may have opportunities to be doing pro bono work or diversity inclusion work, I'm not sure how much of that actually feeds into the metrics when they're looking at who gets promoted and who gets kept on. And although those things may be encouraged, I'm not so sure that enough value is attributed to those, and that very much the metrics that are used is about how much money you bring into the firm. So that is a challenge we face in the law, because as Andy says, you know, how we find meaning and purpose in our lives is really around our relationships and our contribution, and seeing that the work we do aligns with our internal values and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's a challenge in the law. And I think sometimes people feel they've got trapped into a life and a lifestyle that's supported by those earnings, and it's difficult to get out of that. And I think that's a conversation we need to have in law, is about how can we value more what people bring to a firm or to legal practice, that it's not just about money, it's also about delivering good legal services, solving people's problems, using your experience and knowledge to help people, be they a corporate client or somebody who is being faced with deportation by the Home Office. But, you know, you're using your skill, empathy, and all those kinds of things, giving a lot of yourself beyond just your knowledge of the law. And I don't think we always recognize that enough in law. We very much see ourselves as there to provide legal services and chargeable hours. And actually the role that lawyers perform is much bigger than that. And perhaps that would help people feel a sense of purpose and greater value in what they do if they saw the bigger picture. But I don't think we measure that enough or really value it. And I'm sure Jeff has much more comment on that than I would, but I think that's how we see it. Yeah.
I think it's really important. And I think let's discuss about purpose, because purpose, for us as a consultancy, we've done more purpose type workshops in the last 12 months than we've done 11 years in business. And that says to me, in the last 12 months, people are looking for more. And also that the leadership within firms are looking for what is our purpose? What is the reason that our people are getting up out of bed and they're coming to us? And somebody, a great friend of mine, said, if you think about it as volunteers, everyone's volunteering for a law firm because they could go to another firm down the road. And it's actually what purpose is what pulls them together. And it's creating that purpose beyond money, social justice, helping the planet. And Jeff, I know we were chatting the other day, and you were talking about if you were to ever start a law firm, what that law firm would encompass, what it would stand for. Perhaps you can share that with us.
Sure. And again, these are like really important concepts. And, you know, I just want to say where I came to this stuff was from reading others' ideas, but it's all over the place right now. I think that we see that people are focused on this notion of purpose, the why you do things. Simon Sinek says people don't buy what you're selling, they buy why you do it. And there was a great book called The Culture Code that studied top performance of top performing teams in the industry. And this is, you know, studied Google, Pixar, basketball teams, football teams. And the three qualities that they had were, one, they had created a sense of belonging and safety in the teams. The second one is that members of the team shared vulnerability in order to create strong bonds of trust. And the third is that they had a common sense of purpose. And those are the recipes of top performance for the top performing teams in the world. So I tried to experiment with that in my company. And it turns out there's a lot of truth to that, at least in my experience. I think now, you know, kind of what Andy did way ahead of his time, decided like, I'm leaving this because I see what success is in the future. I don't want that, figuring out what his purpose, what his definition of success. I think that now is becoming more mainstream. I think we're finding more junior talent. Certainly in the war for talent, they want something more than becoming a partner. Like they want something more powerful in their life. They care about the environment. They care about the future. And certainly it's what my kids are taught in school. And so I think unless law firms are responsive to that and think about that, if they want to attract that top talent, it can't be our purpose is to make money. Like that corporates have already gotten there. Like you've seen that movement. I think law firms could get there. I threw out an idea, like, you know, imagine if you were a law firm that says, you know what, we'll leave the kind of the transactions or investing that in deals that are related to those kinds of things that destroy the planet. We'll leave that to other law firms. We're not going to do that stuff. We're going to focus on renewable energy projects, and that's going to be an expertise. I think as a law student, having my choice, I'd go, you know what, I want to go work for those people. And I think you draw on the top talent. And I think that kind of, and so on and so on.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Jeff. Andy.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Jeff. I think that's so fundamentally important. And that's where I was in my own story. I couldn't find meaning and purpose through what I was doing anymore outside of the conventional yardstick of money. And that was very much what led me to co-create the One You Know Beer movement. And what I will say around what Jeff was saying there, if you can't find it within the job, and I totally get it, it would be wonderful to be able to realign with your career and find that meaning and purpose. There are other avenues, such as side hustles or creating movements, or like you say, volunteering. So I found this deep meaning and purpose, and it will fill me with meaning and purpose to the day I die, in helping people transform their relationship with alcohol. And I run that for 8 years out of the last 10, alongside running a full-time brokerage. I did it all part-time. It's only in the last year or so that I've stepped out from that, but it gave me this beautiful meaning and purpose to jump up out of bed every day. It fueled my energy in the broking job to generate the income to allow me to support this fledgling movement that we'd started. So there are other ways and means. I totally get it from a really purist point of view. It'd be wonderful to find that in your career and in the job currently, but if you can't, there are other options to maybe explore it outside, and that I think can still fuel your meaning and purpose and keep you in your career a bit longer, I think, because ultimately I think what happens when we lose that, we leave. You know, I think it always ends up in the same place. I think people get disillusioned and they walk away. So if you can find something alongside it, the wonderful irony is that it can keep you in your career a bit longer, I think, personally.
Yeah. Definitely, I agree. And we've got lots more questions coming in. And what I would say is we've got 20 minutes left. We've got quite a few more questions here, which I'm going to take, but do keep sending them. And if we don't have time to answer them today, we can keep them, or one of the panel can come back to us afterwards. We can publish it into a blog. So please, if you've got a question, please send that through to us. So I've got somebody here who says, I think most people would agree that the legal culture, certainly Anglo-American, does not necessarily promote good mental health, and it's been this way for decades. That being the case, how can we change it? Resilience training in law firms feels more like an apology for being in a toxic culture rather than a commitment to change. How can we look after our mental health in law firms be more like building a fence at the top of a cliff rather than catching people in the net at the bottom of the cliff? And I think that's a really good point, and that's something that we talked about when we were doing the practice run, was actually around mental health. Is it the latest topic to attract much talk and little action? Mental health washing, so to speak. Leaders and law firms paying lip service to mental well-being. You hear a lot about law firms having yoga on a 8:30 on a Friday morning, or they have a mental health person that you can go and talk to. But actually then when it comes to billable hours and it comes to an expectation that you're going to answer your emails on holiday, it actually it doesn't fit. So perhaps Elizabeth, perhaps you could be the first to answer that question.
I think that's the challenge of our time, really. I think that, you know, where we've seen mental health and well-being go so much higher up the agenda, we're having these great discussions about it. You know, my school motto was actions speak louder than words. And I think we're really at a time now where we've got to seize this momentum, this conversation, and actually look at what changes do we need to make in the way we practice law, the way we train lawyers to actually create an environment that continues to attract a diverse range of people and that top talent. Because, you know, for many of us, you know, the law is a hugely rewarding career. We want the legal sector to thrive. We rely on the legal sector every day for pretty much everything we take for granted in a civil society. But I think probably the answer lies, from my perspective, would be around trying to bring the different parts of the profession together. So legal education, legal regulation, and legal practice, and look at what's that pathway into the law? How can we better prepare people coming into the law for the realities of life in the law? Then when you are in practice, how can we create cultures that are psychologically safe, that are open? Leadership obviously is a hugely important in a profession that is still very hierarchical and often personality led. You need to see senior people walking the walk, not just talking the talk. And I can't tell you how many times I've gone to give talks in law firms where there'll be one partner in the room out of 100 kind of thing. And I think because what signal is that sending to the rest of the team? I'm not giving up my lunch hour to come to the talk on mental health. I'm too busy. It's not on my agenda kind of thing. So I think that's something that, and it needs to be on just showing up for a talk. I think it needs to be embedded into the agenda for partners meetings, into the business plan. And it's really about, I think, helping managers of law firms and owners of law firms see the business case for mental health, why this makes a difference, that this isn't just about being nice to people. It's about all those things Jeff was talking about. And it's about keeping people in your firm and making it a great place to work. Because I think post-COVID, I think COVID has done us a huge favor. It's been seismic in the world of work. And I think there's no going back. And the expectations of people are different. We're weighing up what we want from our lives. We want purpose and meaning. So I think, you know, this agenda needs to be fully embedded into law firm culture, not in a tick box way. And then I think, you know, we're talking about the legal sector. I think regulation is a really important part of this as well. The standards lawyers are held to, the standards around competency, how people are treated in the disciplinary process, all of those kinds of things. I think the regulators also need to be looking at their role in helping drive some of this change that we need to see. And actually another important player would be in the insurance industry as well. So I think it's trying to bring those different groups together to think collaboratively about what changes can we make in the system that are actually going to make this better? And it's not going to happen overnight, but I think it's incumbent on us now to seize this momentum and really make that happen, because this is the time, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We've got more questions here. We've got another one here. What are your best tips for addressing self-orientated perfectionism? Jeff, perhaps I'll come to you first.
Sure. I think the first best tip I would say is, honestly, would be see a therapist. Like if you have, especially if you work in a law firm and you have the ability to do that, that's the best place to kind of address mental health issues. But let's say it's not at a clinical state and you're just saying like, how do I deal with the voice in my head? I think my second tip would be what Andy had said. I would go read Carol Dweck's Mindset. I would get your mindset shifted around this idea of a fixed and a growth mindset. Because once you do that, that voice in your head that is criticizing yourself, that's that self-oriented one, you start to challenge that and go like, well, actually, no, I am valuable, I am worthy, and I can improve, I can do better. And it makes sense that I didn't do perfectly here. I think that type of thinking, open your mind to those types of books and in those types of articles that are about growth mindset. I think that would be my second best tip. Yeah, I mean, the third one is probably start to talk about it with others who are in similar situations. Ask them if they have those voices in their head. And I think you might find that we all have those voices in our head, and you might find a connection and be supportive to one another. Those are 3 tips that I have.
Might even be able to find a little bit of humor out of it, actually. And that's, you know, one of the things about being able to be vulnerable, and that connection is actually then it doesn't feel so bad, and it's, yeah, being open. But Andy, what about you? What would be your thoughts on that?
Just to build out on what Jeff said there, I think just talking to someone, and it doesn't have to be a therapist. You know, I'm a coach, I train accredited coaches, and you will be amazed at just giving someone the space to talk and listening non-judgmentally is a beautiful experience for so many people. It's just liberating, because no one listens in the world that we live in anymore. You know, everyone's half distracted, or they can't wait to get their conversation out. So actually sitting in a coaching environment or a therapeutic environment and just being able to talk is very often where so many insights come from. So I'd highly recommend that. And if, you know, therapy is too stigmatized, go to coaching. And I'm sure Elizabeth does wonderful work around this, giving people space to talk. I think that's the number 1 tip. And number 2 is awareness. And I think that's why these conversations are so incredibly important. We're just talking about mindfulness style awareness, just awareness of what's going on in my mind. Am I someone that is drawn towards perfectionism? Do I tend to have a fixed mindset? That's the perfect starting point, because most people are unaware and their behaviors are so mindless until we have these type of conversations. So I think awareness is key. We could deepen that into mindfulness awareness. I think it's another beautiful skill that people can cultivate. The work of Carol Dweck was mentioned, and then just talk to someone that's going to listen. And so I'm not talking about a friend or a colleague. I'm talking about a coach or a therapist or someone, you know, I'm sure that Elizabeth offers some type of service around that, and just let it out. I think that's such an important skill that's overlooked for so many people.
Thank you. And Elizabeth?
Yeah, just picking up with Andy, you know, what we have at LawCare is that safe space to talk about things. You know, we're not counselors or therapists, and we don't have a magic wand, but what we do allow is that non-judgmental, empathetic space to talk about things honestly. And many people do find it easier sometimes to talk to people who are not connected to them. It's not easy to admit to your partner or a work colleague how you're feeling about something, but a complete stranger, you don't have to give your name to us, and we'll just listen and help you unpick what's going on and what steps you may need to take. Because I think the challenge in the law, and I think it's across all sectors, is we look around at other people like the swans gliding across, you know, the pond or the lake, and we think everyone else is just managing, but what we don't see is what actually is going on beneath, you know, like the iceberg. And actually most people have had these sorts of thoughts and experiences, and lawyers are very, you know, that inner critic and that inner voice is always on your shoulder, and it's learning how to silence that. But I think another thing actually I've been thinking about while we've been talking is, you know, we're not really equipped very well through our legal education to understand how our minds work. And I was thinking about my son, the book about mindset. One of his teachers recommended that a couple of years ago, there was a parents' evening, and they were talking about how to encourage a growth mindset in your child. And I thought, you know, this is the kind of thing we ought to be doing at law school, is educating people to understand. We all understand how our bodies work to some extent, but we never really learn about our psychology and how our minds work. And, you know, we might even know a little bit what the brain looks like in a brainstem, and that's it, but we don't understand how this all functions. And I think if we had more of that kind of education to help people understand their psychology better and talk about growth mindset, I think that would go a long way to helping people manage and recognize these behaviors in themselves. But yeah, I agree with everything everyone said. I really think it's about talking, because then that's the first step to really admitting something's going on and finding that help.
And what I would say is that after the last webinar that we have, I've been inundated and absolutely delighted to have had lots and lots of calls and Zooms with people who've actually just wanted to talk, who've actually, it's open, they don't know me. Most of these people I've never met. And actually we've sat there on Zoom, they've cried, I've cried. We've had conversations about all types of different things, particularly, and I've raised it before, I lost my mum last year. And a lot of people have gone through grief of some sort, whether that grief's a divorce, whether that grief's losing someone in the family, losing a job. And actually being able to talk to somebody else who they feel can understand and won't judge them, I think is really important. So what I would say is, we've still got about 100 people left on, and obviously clearly not my diary next week. But I am here. I am happy to talk to anyone. Elizabeth has, an amazing helpline. There's lots of people around. There's lots of people using LinkedIn as a fantastic channel to say what's going on in their life and getting the support in that way. But people want to do things in different ways. Some people want to reach out privately. Some people want to use different channels for that. And there are. So I would hope that us having this conversation today, and these conversations are going to continue, we are going to have more of these webinars, that actually it's going to allow people to talk to each other. But I can see we've got lots more questions coming in, and I'm quite keen to get through them. So here's the next one that we have. Okay, so somebody's asking here, who can access the services of LawCare, Elizabeth? Is it any employee or any law firm?
It's anybody working in the legal sector in the UK, whether you are legally qualified as a lawyer, or whether you work in HR or business support or PA, or you're training or studying. So it's anybody that works in the legal sector is able to access LawCare. You can go onto our website, lawcare.org.uk, and on there you will find out how to access our support channels. And we've got lots of resources as well, lots of fact sheets, blogs. We have a podcast series, which Andy has done, the Legal Mind, where you can access all of that, and everything is tailored for people working in the law.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. And we've got another question here. The panel's views on how we can best balance a desire for continuous improvement, always refining and innovating, etc., versus the less positive elements of perfectionism. Perhaps, Jeff, if I could start with you on that one.
Sure. So it's a great question. And I think that probably best balancing it is to be willing to embrace this idea that you can perform better than you're performing today. So accept that. In doing that, you're being vulnerable with yourself. You're going well, what I did today was not perfect. And kind of take a mindset that there's only better versions. There's no best version. I don't think there's anything unhealthy with that. And that might be what you call adaptive perfectionism. I think the less positive elements really have to do with that voice in your head, that self-critic. And if how you're approaching improvement somehow feels like it's creating a sense of shame or embarrassment for yourself, those are good tests and feelings to pay attention to, that you're probably starting to veer into that other category. But I think probably the most freeing concept is just to kind of accept that you're not perfect. And no matter how excellent you performed at that whatever, you can do a better job. And if you accept that, that's a really positive concept. I can do better tomorrow. And I think lean into that type of attitude. That would be my suggestion.
I think, Andy, you mentioned imperfectly perfect before.
Yeah, that's sort of one of my favorite sayings. We're, imperfectly perfect as human beings. And I think it's embracing the fact that our perfection is our best. And I know some people are like, oh, I'm not sure about that because I need to be perfect. But it is. It's if you do your best, that is your level of perfection. I think that's the closest we can get to it. And I think it does come back to that growth mindset. It comes back to that willingness to learn and push yourself out of your comfort zone. And then when things go wrong, don't run away from it. Remove the shame and actually learn from it. I think Elizabeth touched on it earlier. If you reflect on your own life and your career, your biggest learning points almost always come from your failures rather than your successes. Our successes don't really teach us much when we win the accolade or we get the rise. It's when it goes wrong and we make a mistake. If we don't run from it, there's always something there to teach us. So rather than just embracing all the pain, you know, when there's a bit of space, go back and look at how I could improve. And I think that's the best way to inch up and level up in your life, in my opinion.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. We've got 5 minutes left. So I'm going to take one more question, and then I think I'm going to ask the panel to sum up. So I suppose we have covered this a little bit, but let's see if there's anything else that we can tease out here. Somebody's asked how we can get senior leaders in law firms to address these issues and to talk about it. And I guess that's something that keeps coming up in all of the webinars. And Elizabeth, it comes up in the work that we do with the IBA Wellbeing Committee, and it came up. The latest IBA survey that came up said lawyers from every corner of the globe reported that their well-being is well below par. 41% said they could not access help from the leaders in their firm due to stigma or fears that their career would be negatively impacted. So clearly there's still a lot of work to do at the leadership end of firms, and clearly culture plays a huge part of that in different jurisdictions. But perhaps, Elizabeth, what have you found there, and what have you found? Are there any tips that anybody within a firm who wants to lobby the leadership of the firm to do more, anything that they could do?
Well, I think if you can, is to find an ally or supportive partner who is interested in this agenda, either through their own experiences. So I'd say some of the most engaged events I've attended in law firms which have been closed is where they've had a panel with a senior partner, somebody from HR, a trainee solicitor, and everybody leveled by talking about their own experiences with mental health, be it someone in their family or their own struggles, say with depression. And you could almost hear a pin drop in the room when you hear people share their stories, because you're showing your vulnerability. And I think you're showing real leadership when you do that. So I think if you can find people in firms who are willing to speak up, there are more and more senior people in the law. We've got someone on our website who've shared their personal stories of overcoming and living through mental health difficulties. So I think it's about trying to find people who get it and then getting them to work with the rest of the partnership team, perhaps. And I think through education, one of the things that came out from the IBA survey that you're talking about is, I can't remember the statistic off the top of my head, but I think it was only less than 20% of law firms had actually provided any training for their senior managers around mental health and well-being. So I think that's really important, an education piece for partners about this, and also for people that are managing others. Often in law, not often, pretty much always, the people who become managers are the people who are really good lawyers. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're very good at managing people, or they haven't been trained and supported how to do that either. So I think if you're running a firm and you are on the managing partners team or leading the firm, I think it's incumbent on you, if you're not across this stuff, is to find someone who is, and get that into the board's next away day and spend some time talking about it in real terms, and get yourself educated and think about how you roll these things out. But I think it's really about telling stories to begin with is really important. Yeah.
And stories that are brilliant. I mean, Jeff, if I come back to you, we've got a couple of minutes to finish off. You wrote a piece about 2 years ago around perfectionism. You wrote about your own story, and after our webinar about 6 weeks ago, you also wrote again your own story, and you wrote about vulnerability. And those pieces, I mean, I think one had 146 comments on it, 743 likes. You know, these aren't posts that got a couple of clicks and one comment underneath. These are posts, these are stories. You are a leader. You're clearly being vulnerable. You're very happy to do that. You're a buyer of legal services. You are going out there proactively saying to people that you're going to purchase legal services from, I need you to be vulnerable. I need to know what mental health capabilities you've got within your firms. In the last couple of minutes that we've got left, what advice would you give to leaders who are struggling with this, who want to do more?
I would say this, that first of all, I do those things and write those things. I don't find it fun to use the word vulnerable. It's awkward. I know that. I don't, it's uncomfortable. It makes people uncomfortable. But the leader that I want to be, I want to look back on my career and say I was courageous. I took risks. I was innovative. I actually tried to do something that was different that helped improve the profession. In a way, my purpose is to speak to this much younger version of myself from 25 years ago, working in private practice, and try to shape that environment in a way that helps improve it for the betterment of everyone, for the profession, for people who buy the services of that profession. So I'd say that if you're in leadership, it comes with that kind of responsibility almost, that you want to do something with that leadership that's important and powerful, other than just make money. You want to have some type of purpose with it. And I think that these are the types of things that once you take that step, which does feel vulnerable, writing a piece and posting it on LinkedIn, talking about being vulnerable and feelings is not, honestly, after you hit send, you feel very uncomfortable immediately. It takes a little bit of time for you to kind of accept that. But I think doing that in a law firm and being open, don't you want to lead people who look up to you, who relate to you, who feel like you're an authentic leader? That's what I would say. Like that's the prize, is that it's not just you have the title, but people are following you because they're inspired by you, because what you're willing to open up to and how relatable you can be, and actually maybe even create an example for them one day to become leaders. I don't know. That's my thoughts.
I think that's absolutely fantastic, Jeff, and that is, I think, an amazing high for us to end on. We're at 3:15. This has been phenomenal, and as I said, I felt nervous before this. I felt like a bit of an imposter. I wasn't sure I was doing the right thing, but I was brave and I did it, and I'm really glad that we did today. And this isn't the end, as I said. You know, this series is going to continue. So thank you to everyone who's turned up today. Thank you to everyone who's raised questions, but thank you most of all to our absolutely phenomenal panel here today. It's been absolutely fantastic. So if we give a quick wave, and then I'm gonna say goodbye to everybody. So thank you very much, everybody. Take care and see you soon.